And joining us now is Ralph Schoellhammer, visiting fellow at the MCC Budapest. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So Viktor Orbán's activities have drawn some criticism, especially within the European Union. There was almost a universal condemnation of the fact that following his meeting with President Zelensky, he appeared in Moscow all of a sudden, and then Beijing. After that, he decided to meet with former President Donald Trump right after the NATO summit in Washington. So of course, there seems to be a pattern emerging, a pattern of an independent diplomatic initiative, but does it have any chances of success, given that today such large initiatives, they require team play, and Mr. Orban seems to be acting on his own to a large extent.
No, I think you're correct. I mean, Prime Minister Orban is making a huge gamble here. Number one of his gamble is he expects Donald Trump to win the election in November, and believes, which is quite possible, that the Trump approach might bring peace sooner rather than later. And the second gamble I think he takes is that there is actually a party in Moscow, either Putin or the people surrounding Putin, that would be willing to make peace. And I think that's the biggest gamble, because as we have seen in some of your previous reporting also on TVP, right, is that at the moment the Chinese-Russian bloc is outproducing the West in armaments. So there isn't really an incentive for the Russians to stop their military operations, their aggression against Ukraine, because they have the means to do so. So this is a huge gamble by Prime Minister Orban. If it pays off, right, of course, this would be a massive success for him. But if not, this could also be a massive embarrassment. You're absolutely right. And there is a tendency at the moment of self-isolation of Hungary, both within NATO and within the European Union. So I think you're correct in your analysis there as well. On the other hand, of course, you could make the argument that having one player within NATO, within the European Union, who tries to keep communication channels open, that on the long run could also be of benefit. So as you correctly pointed out, there is a bit of a gamble going on here, and it's yet too soon to say how it is going to pay off.
Right, but looking at the situation, well, Hungary's actions could impact both trust and cohesion within NATO. So why do you think that now Viktor Orbán is in fact let's say, putting everything on the table in order to change, let's say, this situation, and is both aligning himself with Russia and trying still to keep his close ties to the West?
I don't think it is fair to say that he's aligning himself with Russia. Now, if we very closely look at what he's doing, right, he's pursuing what one could describe as a foreign policy defined by what he perceives as being Hungary's national interest. So, yes, it is correct, right? There's a different approach from the other European Union members. However, if you look at Slovakia, for example, if you look at Germany, and there we have to distinguish also very often between what Germany is saying and what Germany is doing. If you look at the role that Turkey is playing, kind of we see within NATO and within the European Union that many nation states are kind of carving out their own individual role. The difference between Hungary and Turkey and Germany, and by the way, also my country of Austria, which at this very moment is still receiving over 90% of its gas from the Russians. We just don't say anything about it. The Hungarians, or particularly Prime Minister Orban, they are more open about it. I mean, whether this is part of the strategy or a mistake, I think this is something interesting to discuss. I think what Orban does, which I would do differently if I would be in his position, I would do these negotiations more behind closed doors and not as openly as he does. But I think we should not make the mistake to believe that either the European Union nor NATO are entirely unified at the moment. They are not. I think this is one of the things where we have to be very careful. If we look at the behavior of Turkey, if we look at Slovakia, and there are many diverging interests and positions also within NATO, right? The Baltic states and Poland take a completely different position than Slovakia and Hungary, or Austria again, for example, which proclaims, is neutral in this conflict. But of course, there are still strong dependencies economically on Russia. So what the Chinese and the Russians know, of course, is that they distinguish between the reality and the rhetoric of what NATO and the European Union does. And I think this is the big problem, that they say, oh, you talk a big game, but when we look at the actual actions, we are not very much terrified at the moment. And this is, I think, one of the big problems. Whether or not Orban's actions will be helpful or not helpful in this matter, I think that remains to be seen.
Well, isn't it the case that we have seen the sort of narrative among many countries, including Hungary? I mean, Hungary has been at the forefront of basically saying, look, we need to avoid escalation. We need to find a solution that does not involve any sort of further activities on the part of NATO and so on. But beyond the veil of these slogans, which I mean on the surface they are admirable, like, you know, we don't want war, we want peace. However, the problem is that some countries are exploiting this to their advantage, and these narratives could actually make us sleepwalk into an even worse situation, whereby we agree on something basically that Ukraine would not be really willing to accept, but it would have to cave in under international pressure because of the risk of escalation. But later on, the escalation would come anyway, because Russia doesn't, as you've mentioned, doesn't really have an incentive to stop. It doesn't have plans to stop. I mean, Dmitry Medvedev was recently quoted as saying, we need to prepare to take over all of Ukraine after a potential ceasefire. So why try for any sort of ceasefire? Isn't it the case that we already see a ceasefire is a road leading nowhere?
I think you make an excellent point. Let me try to answer it this way. I think you're 100% correct in your analysis. But the problem I see is the following, that on the long run, structurally, from a technology perspective, the West is stronger than Russia. I would argue that we're also stronger than the Russia and China together. But we are not at the moment, because what has happened also within NATO, right? We know, for example, that the Germans, the Dutch, and many other members of NATO have not met their 2% of GDP defense spending goals. So the issue that we have at the moment is that we cannot really bring the resources we have to the front lines. The Russians can do this because they have prepared for this conflict for a long time. And if we look at their behavior over the last decade, this is something that they have prepared for. So when we say, as you correctly point out, if we play for time, I think there is potentially an element that is helpful in this, because we are at the moment not in a position to bring the armaments, to bring the economic and military force that is needed to the front. You just mentioned in one of your previous parts of your show, right, that now Poland, Italy, Germany, and you know, have agreed to produce medium and long-range missiles together. Yeah, but that's now 2 years into the conflict, so they now just have agreed to start producing those things. But the Russians and the Chinese are already producing them. So the problem is that we are behind in making the material conditions to deter the Russians from fighting this war. And I think this is what the Russians, of course, know as well. They basically, as we just said, right, you're absolutely correct, they say, you guys talk a big game, but what can you actually do? So when we say, which personally, of course, I fully agree with, we want to, in the ideal case, re-establish Ukrainian sovereignty within the borders before, let's say, the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014. How exactly will we come into a position where we are strong enough in order to negotiate or to wrestle this away from the Russians? We are nowhere near in that position. And the other point, of course, you made is trying to integrate Ukraine into NATO, both while they're in a state of war and while NATO is, as it is at the moment, not prepared for a conflict with Russia, is, on their part, a very, very dangerous gamble. Now, I don't believe that Putin would be willing to use nuclear weapons. I don't think we are on the brink of nuclear war, but I would also not say that there is no risk whatsoever. And I think to kind of triangulate between those risks is an important element. And this is, again, where Viktor Orbán comes in. I think what he's trying to do, kind of keeping open these communication channels, is potentially a step in the right direction. I think, and I agree with you on that, I think he could coordinate this better with his partners in NATO and within the European Union. So, for example, I do not understand when he says, I have certain trips planned, Kiev, Beijing, or Moscow before that, then Beijing, then Washington. Why can he not, at least behind closed doors, coordinate this with his partners instead of kind of sucker punching them with just doing it and then, quote unquote, saying, well, that's nobody's business. Of course it's everybody's business, because he does act as if he's acting on behalf of the European Union or others.
Right, and just lastly, I know that we are short on time, but I feel like this one is quite important to tie these knots together now, following your thought and coming back to what you mentioned, that Hungary is following its own national interest. Now, what is there in it then for Hungary if they would mediate the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Well, I think when we look at Hungarian history, right, or Hungarian historical experiences, is one which I think we all would agree on, that generally peace is preferable to war, whether it's in Central Europe or Eastern Europe. We know that the Hungarians, but as I said before, this is not just true for the Hungarians. I think they're just more honest about it. There are still very close economic ties between Hungary and Russia, as there are close economic ties between Austria and Russia, as there are still in other ways, close economic ties between other European countries and Russia. And of course, this is a consideration that plays a role in this as well. But overall, if you would also, by the way, poll the European public, again, things and moods are shifting. And I'm saying this as an analyst, not as an activist. But there is a sense, and by the way, also in the United States, of course, in the public, not just in the political sphere, that there is a push towards finding ways of ending this conflict. Now, we have to find ways, as we discussed on the show before, we have to find ways to come to a point where we can get the best possible deal for Ukraine. The question is, what is the best and achievable deal at this moment in time? Because just this last point, because I think this is so important. Everyone, me included, right? I wish we could go back to the borders of 2014, but is this a realistic scenario at the moment? And I know this is a very tough and very hard question to ask, but in order to get to that point, NATO and the West need to be in a position that they can set the terms, meaning that we are in a position where we can deter Russia from either continuing its offensive or incentivizing them to take parts of their territorial gains back. But we are not in that position because they believe that they have the upper hand at the moment. As long as Putin believes that he has the upper hand, nothing is going to change. In order to change his impression he has the upper hand, we have to ramp up military production, we have to ramp up the economic power, we have to ramp up actually effective sanctions. And none of this is happening at the moment, at least not to the degree that would be necessary.
And last but not least, of course, we need to make sure that Ukrainian agency is maintained throughout the process so that Western powers do not simply shake hands with Russia and possibly China above the heads of Ukrainians. Because, I mean, from our historical experiences, this never really ends well. Ralph Schoellhammer was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and
Thank you so much for having me.
Insight.